These are the lectionary texts for Palm Sunday, also known as Passion Sunday, which will occur this year on March the 24th. You notice I use Palm and Passion. Some churches emphasize that this is the beginning of the week in which Christ will die, obviously Sunday being the beginning of the next week in which Christ is raised. And it's also Palm Sunday, which is the one that I think most churches have traditionally celebrated. I'm not going to utilize all of the texts that are for that Sunday. There are several texts for Palm Sunday, and I'm going to work with two of those. And then there is also a text that I'm going to use from if it were to be Passion Sunday. It's always been my practice to do both. Oftentimes I have started in with the service as though it were a celebration and a triumph, and ended the service with sort of a pensive notion about what was to come. I think the text that I have picked out of the multitude of texts here, and I'll just name them, and then if you'd like to look them up, you can, but on my channel, you're only going to see three texts. There's Mark 11, 1 through 11. I'm going to use that one. I'm not using John 12, 12 to 16. It could have been used too. But the Mark 11 text, Psalm 118, 1 and 2, verses 19 to 29. But we're going to talk about the middle section. I never quite understand why some of these things are skipped. And I think that what has been skipped here is really potent to how the week begins on what we call Palm Sunday. And then from the liturgy of the Passion, or for if it were to be celebrated as Passion Sunday, there's Isaiah chapter 50, verses 4 through 9, Psalm 31, 9 to 16. I think that's a really great section of that psalm. The text I'm going to use from the Passion lectionary is Philippians 2, 5 through 11, which is really mostly an early Christian hymn that the Apostle Paul pulls into his text, and also Mark 14 or Mark 15. And you can read those and go, oh, I see why that's on Passion Sunday. So we're going to begin with Mark chapter 11, 1 through 11. And what I'd like to caution about, I suppose, is particularly for those who have grown up in the church. If you haven't grown up in the church, you really have a leg up on a lot of special occasions, because those of us that have grown up in the church tend to merge all of the gospel accounts together, and then we get a certain picture that none of the gospels as they stand alone would give us. And the problem with that is we truly need to listen to each gospel on its own terms. I had a friend years ago who witnessed a strange occurrence, and you could call it an auto accident, I suppose. There was a pickup truck that was overloaded with stacks of used tires, and it overturned or it hit something. Anyway, all the tires just exploded into the air and rolled down the street and crashed into other vehicles and created a lot of havoc and caused a lot of auto damage. So the people that were there waited to be interviewed by the police, and my friend, who is very bright, very observant, his career calls on him to be extremely observant, waited for the police to interview him, and he told them what he thought he had seen that created the whole spectacle. After they'd interviewed several people, one of the cops came back to him and said, just want you to know, what you say you saw happen could not possibly have happened. And yet there he was, an eyewitness. Now that's not to discredit any of the Gospels, but what it is to say is that at the moment that Jesus was coming into the city, no one who witnessed it truly understood the importance of what was going to be taking place that week. So everything we have are recollections that look back after Easter, way after Easter, and trying to reflect on all of the things that Jesus did. And so with the Gospels, we have varying accounts of that Palm Sunday event. And so we're looking seriously at Mark's Palm Sunday event. And what's worth noticing at the beginning is that all of the celebratory stuff that's occurring in chapter 11 and in those first 11 verses, the first 10 verses at least, take place outside the city. They don't take place inside the city. It truly appears as though when Jesus enters the city in verse 11, that there's no big ruckus, that any sense of celebration was occurring among a small band of folk on the outside as they walked toward the city. There are several other things that are worth noting, I think, in Mark's account. And I think it's worth understanding again that the people who saw Jesus coming into the city weren't really clear on just who he was or what his intentions were. When they speak those words about Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord, blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Now that is not exactly a celebration of Messiah. This is an optimism and a hope that the will of God will at some point in God's own good time take place. That's entirely different than the Messiah coming. And keep in mind that these are people, it's just been a few chapters before that it was Peter who said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of God." That doesn't mean that everybody was registering with anything such as this. Albert Schweitzer, who was theologian, missionary, and fantastic organist. My mother had a full collection of his organ music on 78s, the old vinyl 78s. Albert Schweitzer, speaking about this text, suggests that the people thought he was the new Elijah, the forerunner of the Messiah coming in. So that's worth noting that all the way through the passion, his arrest, the execution on the cross, and even into and after the resurrection, it's not as though people had a clear picture. It magnifies even more when Jesus is on the cross and he says, "Father, forgive them, they know not what they do." He could just as easily have said, "Father, forgive them. They're really not clear on what's going on in the celestial field of spiritual warfare." That seems to be true as well. So they perceive this is one who is coming in the name of the Lord. They also perceive that one day there will be the coming kingdom of their ancestor David, which in itself implies a throwing over, maybe by violent means, of those that are oppressing the Jewish people at that moment in time, because David was a warrior king. They have nothing in mind about a spiritual warrior or any such thing as that. Then what happens the rest of the day, which is kind of a setup, I think, that lets us know that there's a not yetness that is in this event. He entered Jerusalem, went to the temple, and when he looked around at everything, as it was late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. Says a couple of things. Not much happened in the city, number one, on that day. And number two, the 12 were not with him. It's almost as though, there's an old Three Stooges to where there's a scary setup, and Moe says to the other two, "You fellas go ahead, I'm right behind you." And we almost see this kind of thing occurring here with the 12. It certainly appears as though they get to the city gates. They're already a little concerned about what might go on. As Thomas said way back earlier, when Jesus said he had to go to Jerusalem, and Thomas had said, "Well, let us go and die with him." Well, clearly they're not so sure. And so after all this coming down from the Mount of Olives, the hosannas and so forth. It sounds like the 12 are saying to Jesus, you go right ahead. We'll stay here and watch the gate. They don't go with him. He goes with them, or they go with him to Bethany after he's looked around and he leaves the city. So that should help us a little bit, that there is a level of celebration, but it is not over the top in Mark's account. There certainly is some level of foreboding that there are a lot of things that are not a part of this tide of sweeping victory that we tend to want to celebrate on Palm Sunday, which is another reason I like to tie together the Palm Sunday with the notion that it really is the beginning of the week of Christ's own passion. Our one other little element. This whole idea from chapter 11 through chapter 13 really sets up the whole passion event, which of course is arrest and crucifixion, arrest, trial, and crucifixion. It's worth noting that in these verses here are the communities that are also mentioned in Zechariah chapter 14, beginning around the 4th verse, that speak about the Mount of Olives and so forth, in a way that I'm guessing that the first readers of the Gospel of Mark would also have had in mind. I don't know that, I'm just taking a stab. But Zechariah's account here pairs well, you might say, with what's going on in Mark chapter 11, 12, and 13. Our Psalm 118, and I think I said in the introduction that I really don't understand why we skip verses. The lectionary text is verses 1 and 2, and then jumping to 19. It is a song of victory, so that kind of makes sense for Palm Sunday. But it's the middle, I think, that is not being used, that to me helps us to flesh out everything that is happening and beginning to happen in the life of Jesus. It is a king's victory when he comes to the temple to celebrate some victory he's had on the battlefield. There are a multitude of voices here, so it makes it very difficult to try to say who is doing what voice throughout the psalm. But verses 5 up until we get to verse 19 are verses about the trouble, the distress, the possible defeat of the king, and how the king is pulled out of that by his God. And isn't that where life really works? And isn't that what we've truly witnessed with Christ? Is it's not about this everlasting triumph. It is about the human experience of suffering and defeat, and then being pulled from defeat by the power of God. And by pulled from defeat, I don't mean necessarily that we're never defeated, but what I mean is our defeat is never the end, in the same way that the death of Christ and his passion was simply not the end. And I think those verses that we skip in chapter 118 are very helpful to remind us of the process of the human spirit, that we become much stronger, not just by going from win to win to win, but we become much stronger because of the challenges we face, the fears that come our way, the threats to our person, and even to the point of having to face defeat or even death. And it's beyond that we can celebrate not only the power of God that pulls us through, whether it's after the moment of death and into eternity, but throughout life. Even though we know that life doesn't always turn out the way we would have expected or hoped, For people of faith, we have a sense that somehow God is working even in our worst moments. And in fact, it's often those worst moments that give us our strongest impact when we come through those worst moments. So I encourage you with Psalm 118, go ahead and read 1 and 2 and then pick up again at 19 to get that sense of the victory. But then go back and look at verses 5 through 18 to see what actually brings about the true celebration is this deep threat of defeat. All humans understand that quite well. The last text, which I think pulls together triumph, frailty, and then triumph again, is from Philippians, the second chapter, beginning with the 5th verse. And, really, I think it ought to begin with the first verse in that chapter of Philippians. I'm thumbing through, so obviously I can't talk and find it at the same time. So hang on, here we go. I really think, look at the first 4 verses of chapter 2 in Philippians as well, and then read what most scholars, I can't say all because I don't know all, but what most scholars believe to be an early Christian hymn, and that would pick up in verse 6. Verse 5 begins, "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." And then from then on it becomes the hymn, "Who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited. He emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness, and being found in human form. He humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." So we see the God who cannot be defeated in the person of Christ, who submits himself to defeat in the same way that true humans, full of frailty, go through periods of victory and defeat, and victory and defeat, and victory and defeat. There's something else in translation that's important here. The way I read it is one translation, and I don't mean by one Bible, but one translation of the Greek. And I'll reread it, and then I'll tell you another translation of the Greek. "Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus." That is sort of an imperative. Do this in the same way that it was with Christ. Okay, that's fine. I'm not going to knock it. But it could also be equally translated. Let me get it right here first. It could be translated, "The same mind that was in Christ Jesus is also in you." In other words, a reminder that the people that are in Christ already have this mind, this willingness to submit to the will of God, to humble ourselves, and to be obedient as slaves or servants of the Most High. So instead of saying, "I want you to be like Jesus," it could be, the power is already within you because of what Christ has done, that you can be these things. Maybe you think that's a distinction without a difference, but I think it really speaks very powerfully of the grace of God that is already given, freely given, so that it's not that we must do this first. It's already, we have the capacity because of what Christ has done for us. And then we have this Christ that we can model our lives off of, because it's already within us to be able to model in that way. Never perfectly, because there's always frailty, and there's always defeat around the corner. But ultimately, we have this power within us, although it will never be perfectly understood by us on this side of the grave, only on the next. In the same way that people did not understand the Christ on this side of the grave. but only on the next. Well, I hope you've enjoyed these. I hope these are helpful for Palm Sunday, March the 24th, and I'll look forward to doing another one of these for you next week.